two neighboring nations with the same roots but such conflicting loyalties could only experience an ambivalent relationship ranging from peaceful cooperation to open hostility. Perhaps nowhere has this relationship been better reflected than in southwestern Ontario. Separated by only a kilometer of water from one of the largest cities in the United States, Essex County is the oldest continuously settled area of Ontario. It would be neither old nor continuously settled if not for the presence of a strong militia. They are the citizen soldiers, the farmers, businessmen, laborers, and others who, when called to Canada's defense, have beaten their plowshares into swords. Essex County encompasses Canada's southernmost landmass. It forms the tip of a peninsula that reaches into the heartland of the United States, with southern extremes that rest on the same latitude as Northern California. Bounded on three sides by water, this quirk of geography has given the Windsor-Essex area strategic importance in Canada's history.
The Detroit River area is a natural bottleneck in the commerce that goes up and down the Great Lakes. And prior to the establishments of roads and modern transportation, definitely the fastest, most efficient method to transport goods of any nature, whether it was people, commercial cargo, anything of the like. Definitely the most efficient way of transporting these things was by ship. And being a narrowing of the transportation route, the Detroit River therefore becomes of strategic importance because you can control all that commerce.
This geostrategic advantage was well appreciated by Cadillac when he established Fort Pontchartrain de Detroit at the present site of Detroit, Michigan. The small fort, however, was surrounded by three large Indian tribes whose goodwill could not be taken for granted. Vastly outnumbered and well beyond immediate assistance from the army, Cadillac took the precaution of making each of his Canadians, as the French settlers came to be known, a member of the sedentary militia.
The difference between an active and sedentary militia was that the sedentary militia were usually based in that area. They didn't have the same level of training as the active. The active could be called upon in time of war to stand beside the regular forces and to take part in any battles. The sedentary militia was more a social grouping in the area. They could do a bit of fighting, but they weren't expected really to bear the brunt of any major actions.
With the surrender of French Canada to the British, Fort Detroit was ceded in 1760. The Canadian militia were called together and disarmed. They were reformed in time to help defend the fort during the Indian Uprising of 1763 and accompanied British raiding parties during the American Revolution.
As a result of Jay's Treaty in the 1790s, the British ceded the Northwest Territory and Detroit to the Americans. And the British looked for a site to establish their new fort, and they wanted to maintain a presence in the area as well so that they could have their chance at controlling the commerce going up and down the Detroit River. The result was they chose what later became the site of the town of Amherstburg. The reason the British chose the site opposite Boblo Island to establish their fort was because although the river is fairly wide at this point, the natural channel, the deepest portion of the river, in fact flows between the shoreline and Boblo Island, which is only a matter of a few hundred yards wide. And by placing the fort right at that narrow of the already narrow river, they're able at point-blank range to cover the channel with their guns and absolutely stop any traffic on the river that they didn't want to see moving.
A large number of Loyalists followed the British from Detroit. With the small number of troops stationed at the new fort, the citizens had to form the backbone of local defense. So, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Essex Militia were raised.
Canada was always a lightly populated area, and in order to defend the area, the British wanted to keep a small number of troops here for the defense of the colony. But given British imperial obligations elsewhere, there were never enough troops available in this area to undertake all of the defense. So that's where the importance of the militia is established. The age of recruitment would change depending on how serious the demand was, but able-bodied men of what you might consider to be fighting age, late teens, 20s, and 30s, were really expected to turn out to aid with the defense of the colony.
The importance of the Essex militia defense of the area was clearly demonstrated in July of 1812. The American General Hull from Fort Detroit landed at the town of Sandwich with a force of 2,500 men and marched on Fort Malden. At River Canard, they met a mixed force of 400 British regulars, Indians, and militia. The first shots of the War of 1812 were fired here, persuading General Hull to return to Detroit. British General Isaac Brock arrived shortly after, and with a similar mixed force, captured Fort Detroit. It was later recaptured by the Americans, who once again, and this time successfully, invaded Essex County. Some of the Essex militia escaped with British regulars and continued to fight along the Niagara frontier. But from 1813 to the Peace of 1815, Essex County was under American occupation.
The years subsequent to the War of 1812 were rather peaceful. Relations with the Americans were fairly good until in 1837 the Upper Canadian Rebellion, or as it's called in the United States, the Patriot Wars, broke out, initially with Mackenzie's revolt in Toronto and Papineau in Quebec. And there were 4 actions during the rebellion that took part in the Detroit River area. The militia were involved in all 4 of those actions, and British regulars were involved in some of them.
Most local British troops had been sent to fight the rebels in the Toronto area. It fell to the 1st and 2nd Battalions of Essex militia to protect Essex County. To augment their forces, a 3rd Battalion was temporarily raised under the command of Colonel John Prince. Notably, there was a large number of black volunteers. For them, the memory of recently escaped slavery was too fresh. They would fight any attempt at American-style government in Canada.
The black troops in the militia were in their own company under a British officer, a captain, and they served as a segregated unit. They also had some very prominent members of the black community in their ranks, notably a Josiah Henson, who we believe to be the Josiah Henson of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe's writings. And they were the 3rd company of the Essex militia. The first action during the 1837-38 rebellion in the Detroit River area was what is called the Schooner Ann incident. And the rebels, or as they called themselves, patriots, captured a schooner, armed it with cannon, and sailed up that narrow channel between Amherstburg and Boblo Island and shelled the town of Amherstburg. The militia very quickly turned out, and at this point there was no regular British presence at Fort Malden. The militia turned out, and their fire from the shore supposedly crippled the helmsman of the ship. It ran aground, and the Essex militia waded out into the river and captured the schooner Ann. This was the 9th of January of 1838, and you can only imagine how cold the water must have been for these men to wade out and capture this ship where it had run aground on Elliott's Point. It must have been reasonably cold because by the time of the next battle, which was February 24th, that was the Battle of Fighting Island, which is just off the shore from LaSalle. And at Fighting Island, a rebel group marched across the frozen Detroit River and set up camp on the island, mounted a couple of crude cannons, and declared that they had captured the island. The 24th Regiment of Foot turned out from Fort Malden, and the Essex militia quickly marched across the ice from the Canadian shore, routed the rebels on Fighting Island, and they fled back across the ice to the American shore. The third action in this area during the rebellion was on the 3rd of March, and that was the Battle of Pelee Island. And of all the fighting that went on in this area, it was the one that closest resembled a proper pitched battle. The Patriots marched across the ice from Ohio and captured Pelee Island. And it was a couple of days before word reached the garrison Fort Malden that Pelee Island had been captured. The garrison turned out, again with the militia and also with Indians in support, and marched to Pelee Island and fought a proper pitched battle, with the result that the rebels retired again and crossed the ice back to American shore. There were some significant casualties in that battle as well. The final action in the Detroit River area during the rebellion was the Battle of Windsor, and that was December 4th of 1838. And the rebels seized a couple of vessels, sailed across the river at night, and first attacked the militia barracks in the town of Sandwich, and surrounded the barracks, set it afire, and forced the militiamen inside out. They also, the American rebels, captured and killed the regimental surgeon of the 34th Regiment, Dr. Hume. And it was this action later so enraged John Prince, as commander of the Essex militia, that he ordered some of the American prisoners summarily executed.
For the first time, during the 1837-38 rebellion, the brunt of responsibility for area defense had been borne by the militia. The Essex militia, reinforced by the neighboring Kent militia, had accounted for itself well. After years of peace with the United States, British troops were permanently withdrawn from Fort Malden in 1851. Defense of the area was now largely in the hands of the sedentary Essex militia. Continued peace led to a decline in militia interest. Except for a short time when several independent rifle companies were formed and a brief embodiment as the 23rd Volunteer Light Infantry, there were no active militia in Essex County. There was a move to have a new county battalion formed, but it was not until Louis Riel launched his rebellion in 1885 that it was accomplished. On June 12th of that year, the 21st Essex Battalion of Infantry was formed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel J.R. Wilkinson and headquartered in Windsor. Although the 21st was not allowed to participate in quelling the rebellion, it set about training to a standard which soon gained it a Canada-wide reputation for smartness and efficiency. With the outbreak of the Boer War in 1899, 17 officers and men of the 21st volunteered and served with the Canadian contingent. In 1902, the present armories was built for the battalion. It was also the year that President Theodore Roosevelt visited Detroit. The young Canadian unit was thought of so highly by its American neighbors that they were invited to Detroit to parade in front of him. It was the first time that foreign troops had been reviewed by an American president on U.S. soil.
I first joined the Army at Windsor about 1912-13 in the 21st Essex Fusiliers. And I stayed with them till the war broke out. And they had these pipe clay helmets then and the chin straps for their dress outfit. It was a smart looking outfit. And Colonel Weigel was in charge of the 21st for years. When war first declared, it took 2 weeks before everybody got enthused in the war. It's funny how it built up. It built up so fast it made your head swim. Everybody was in favor, and everybody was patriotic, and It was a fever that went through the population. Times were bad and work was bad, and it started giving all these guys a job, especially the Army was loaded with recruits. You get that $1.10 a day.
Prior to the First World War, the system that existed was a scattering of militia units whose loyalty was to the local area. They'd been raised by prominent individuals in the area. The government slowly became involved by providing a bit of equipment, a bit of funds for training. With the First World War, the whole system that had existed was scrapped by Colonel Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense. He scrapped the old regimental or militia system that existed and gave them all numbered units and gave authorization now to new individuals to raise battalions who he decided to send overseas.
The militia tradition of recruiting men who lived, worked, and played together to fight side by side was broken. Many established units, including the 21st Essex Fusiliers, were ignored for active service. However, the commanding officer